In 1835, in the quiet, Puritan, washed town of Ashford, Virginia, the Harrison family unveiled what should have been a symbol of status, a handcrafted mahogany canopy bed, shipped from Boston and rumored to have belonged to a judge. But within weeks, whispers spread that the bed was not meant for sleep at all. Neighbors spoke of children going missing, of lullabies sung when no one was in the room, of the Harrisons' strange new obsession with coffins, collecting them, measuring them, storing them in the parlor as though awaiting occupants. When one family servant disappeared without a trace, people began to notice something else. The Harrisons never seemed to rest. Their eyes grew hollow, their skin pallid, and yet the bed remained perfectly made, untouched by human dreams. It was never truly a bed. It was a coffin refashioned, a vessel for rituals no one dared name. The Harrisons had turned sleep into burial, rest into possession, and by 1835 the town had begun to whisper the name it carries still, in secret histories and suppressed sermons, the bed of the dead. To understand the Harrisons, you must first understand the curse of their bloodline. The Harrisons were among Virginia's founding gentry, landowners who prospered through cotton, tobacco, and the quiet exploitation of the bodies beneath them. They built their fortune on unmarked graves, a legacy the town never dared acknowledge but always felt beneath its soil. By the early 1800s, their wealth had curdled into eccentricity. Old diaries reveal a family obsessed with the boundary between life and death. They collected mortuary texts from Europe, studied resurrection sermons, and commissioned sketches of coffins, more often than portraits. Church records show that the Harrisons sat in the front pew, yet their donations were always in the form of oak, iron, or silk, materials for burial rather than worship. Their youngest daughters were dressed in white even after they passed adolescence, as though preparing them for premature funerals, and then came the bed. Imported under cover of night, hidden beneath canvas and secrecy, it was not a gift but an heirloom. Whispers claimed it was not new at all, that it had lain in a Boston courthouse basement after a judge who presided over trials of witchcraft and heresy refused to be buried without it. For the Harrisons, it was the perfect acquisition. A piece of furniture that was not simply for sleep but for containment, the bed arrived on a wagon in late autumn. Witnesses described its strange weight. 6 men strained beneath it, yet the wood did not creak as though resisting being carried. It was mahogany, yes, but darker than any wood Ashford had seen, its grain mottled like bruised flesh. The canopy was carved with grotesque floral patterns, flowers that twisted back into themselves like closed mouths. Most unsettling was the headboard, etched with shallow grooves that resembled tally marks, but deeper examination showed them to be scratches. From the inside, the Harrisons placed the bed in the center of their upstairs chamber, directly beneath a window that overlooked the town cemetery. It was never seen unmade, though no one ever claimed to sleep in it. The linens, crisp and white, never wrinkled. The pillows, plump and waiting, never indented. Yet neighbors swore they heard noises from the open window at night, a low groan like wood strained under pressure. Others said it was a voice, faint lullabies, fragments of scripture spoken backward, sighs that did not belong to the living. When their house servant, Mary Ann, confided that she felt a draft rising from beneath the bed, the Harrisons dismissed her. Within a week, she vanished. Her absence was never investigated. From that point forward, the town began to suspect the truth. The Harrisons had not purchased a bed at all. They had installed an altar. Ashford was no ordinary Virginia town. Founded in 1792, it was carved out of land once used as an unmarked burial ground for indentured servants, enslaved men and women, and the nameless poor. The town prospered quickly. Tobacco warehouses, a stone courthouse, and a modest whitewashed church with a bell that tolled more often for funerals than weddings. The residents were Protestant in name, but whispers told another story. Behind sermons of virtue were rituals of silence, strange processions into the cemetery at dusk, and midnight gatherings in the church basement where hymns twisted into dirges. Ashford's streets were narrow, crooked, and damp, and the houses leaned too close together, as if hiding something in their shadows. Children were taught never to speak the names carved faintly on the worn tombstones behind the church. Their parents never explained why, so when the Harrisons brought the bed into their home, the town did not resist. It recognized the people had seen coffins carried through the square too often, seen bodies lowered without mourning, seen ministers with soil beneath their fingernails. Ashford was a place where death was never far. The Harrison bed only made what was hidden visible. It began with the servants. Mary Ann vanished first, but her name was never written into town records. Then came Samuel, a stable hand who slept in the Harrisons' barn. His cot was found empty, his boots still neatly by the door. At first, townsfolk whispered of runaways, servants fleeing hardship, but Ashford was small. No one passed unnoticed, and no one left without papers. The rumors hardened when two local boys disappeared. They had been invited by the youngest Harrison daughter to play in the upstairs parlor. Their parents never saw them again. The Harrisons held a service, but no bodies were presented, only two coffins lowered into the earth. Neighbors swore that on the night of their burial, they heard knocking from beneath the soil. The bed remained untouched in the Harrisons' chamber. Sheets immaculate, canopy closed like a mouth refusing to speak. Yet the family's behavior grew more erratic. Windows shuttered in daylight, faint singing at night, the sound of wood grinding against wood, like nails dragged across a coffin lid. The disappearances marked a shift. Ashford no longer believed the Harrisons were eccentric. They believed the family was feeding something that breathed beneath their roof. By 1836, the Harrisons' parlor looked less like a home and more like a mortuary. They ordered coffins in bulks, large, lined with silks or stuffed with straw. Deliveries arrived weekly, each met with the same explanation: preparedness. Yet the coffins were never sold, never gifted, never buried. They were stacked along the walls, polished, dusted, and arranged as though waiting for occupants. Guests described the scene as unbearable. The smell of resin and pine clung to the air. Candles flickered against varnished wood. The family insisted on sitting among the coffins as they drank tea, their conversation drifting inevitably to questions of burial depth, soil weight, and decomposition. The youngest Harrison boy was seen measuring neighbors in the street, stretching string from head to toe, muttering about fit. And still the bed stood upstairs, pristine, untouched, as if the coffins below were offerings to it. Some swore that if you pressed your ear to the coffin lids you would hear sighs, like sleepers shifting in restless dreams. By now, Ashford's ministers had stopped speaking of salvation. Their sermons shifted to endurance, patience, and silence. They urged the town to leave the Harrisons undisturbed, to trust God's mystery. But the truth was obvious. The Harrisons were preparing not for their own deaths, but for the deaths of others. At night, Ashford became a town of listeners. Windows cracked open, curtains pulled back just enough, ears straining for the noises drifting from the Harrison house. What they heard was not human. Some described it as the groaning of wood, as if the bed were settling. Others swore it was rhythmic, deliberate, an inhale followed by an exhale, as though the mahogany itself possessed lungs. Mothers reported hearing lullabies carried on the wind, unfamiliar tunes sung in a language no one recognized. Fathers claimed scripture echoed faintly, but with words reversed, syllables dragging like feet on stone. The most chilling reports came from children. They said the bed called to them, a whisper at their windows, promising warmth, safety, or simply rest. A few vanished after repeating the phrases aloud, walking barefoot through the night toward the Harrisons' estate. Those who dared to step inside the house spoke of vibrations. The floorboards trembled slightly, as though the house itself were breathing. In the upstairs chamber, they swore the bed's canopy shifted ever so slightly, like lungs expanding. When one neighbor, overcome with dread, pressed his ear against the polished wood, he staggered back pale and silent. He never told anyone what he heard. By morning, his tongue had swollen so badly he could no longer speak. The sound of the bed was never just noise. It was invitation. The Harrisons' home had a room that was never meant for children, though they called it the playroom. It was upstairs, across from the chamber where the bed sat waiting. Inside, the walls were painted in pastel shades, now cracked and peeling. A rocking horse stood still in the corner, its mane worn thin. Dolls, too many to count, were propped against the walls, their glass eyes staring toward the bedchamber door. Visitors swore the dolls shifted when unobserved, their heads tilted closer to the doorframe. Children from the town were often invited there by the Harrison daughters, orphans especially, those who lived under the church's care and had no families to question their absence. They played with the toys, ate sugared cakes, and laughed at first, but always at some point they grew quiet. Their gazes drifted toward the door across the hall. More than one child claimed to hear someone calling from inside the Harrison chamber. Not the voice of a man or woman, but something softer, fainter, a lullaby weaving through the cracks. The Harrisons would let them play late, sometimes past midnight. Then in the morning, a coffin would appear in the parlor below. But no child's name was ever carved into the wood. No headstone bore their memory. The church kept no records. Ashford's children were being fed into silence one by one. Those closest to the Harrisons began to leave behind fragments of truth. Letters, diary pages, hastily scrawled confessions. One servant wrote that each night she heard the sound of wood inhaling from upstairs. She described cold air flowing down the staircase as though pulled from her chest. Another claimed she saw the youngest Harrison boy slide beneath the bed frame, only to emerge hours later with black stains on his hands. The most disturbing account came from a maid who was dismissed for asking too many questions. In her letter, preserved only in fragments, she described the bed as a mouth with no tongue hungry for the living. She insisted she saw the canopy shift as if something pressed upward from inside. When she brought her testimony to the local minister, he burned it in the churchyard fire. Some truths, he told her, are not meant to be spoken. But her words survived in whispers. Servants who fled told the same story. The bed was not furniture. It was a coffin turned inside out, built to deceive the eye. And once someone lay upon it, they did not rise again. The testimonies were dismissed, hidden, or silenced. But the pattern was clear. The Harrisons were not sleeping. They were feeding the bed with lives the town chose not to protect. By 1837, Ashford was no longer ignorant. It was complicit. The ministers stopped preaching salvation and began to preach silence. God buries his mysteries, one sermon declared, and so must we. Parents who had lost children were persuaded to accept the coffins without question, told that grief itself was sinful if it resisted providence. The town's leaders, many of them bound to the Harrisons through business and blood, issued no investigations. Instead, they wrote new laws. No one could exhume a coffin without church permission, and any public accusations against respected families were deemed blasphemy. Ashford's people began to speak in euphemisms. Children did not vanish. They were taken to God's rest. Coffins without bodies were called faith burials, and the Harrison estate was no longer called a home but a house of solemn waiting. Yet everyone knew. They heard the night noises. They saw the shuttered windows. They smelled the resin of endless coffins, but fear held them fast. To resist was to risk drawing the bed's attention, and in Ashford, silence became survival. The first coffin without a body was lowered into Ashford's soil on a rainy March morning. It belonged to a child named Thomas Whittaker, aged 7. The coffin was small, lined with satin, and carried through the town square with solemn ceremony. The Harrisons walked at the front of the procession, their black attire immaculate, their faces calm, almost serene. But when the coffin lid was briefly lifted for the minister's blessing, the townsfolk glimpsed emptiness. No boy, no body, only a folded white sheet, creased as though it had been slept in. Whittaker's parents wept, but their cries were muted by the minister's hand upon their shoulders. Faith does not require sight, he told them. The townsfolk echoed his words, turning grief into ritual silence. That night, the ground at Whittaker's grave was disturbed. Neighbors swore they heard knocking, 3 steady thuds, like a child rapping from beneath the earth. By morning, the soil was flat again, the grave undisturbed. From that day forward, empty coffins became a familiar sight in Ashford. The town's funerals shifted from mourning the dead to burying absence. The Harrisons' youngest son, Nathaniel, was only 9 when he began speaking to the bed. Witnesses claimed he would sit cross-legged on the floorboards, whispering into the mahogany frame as though confiding in a friend. At night, his voice carried through the shutters, soft, conspiratorial, responding to murmurs no one else could hear. Nathaniel's drawings, later discovered in a locked trunk, showed the bed not as furniture but as a figure. Long arms stretching from beneath its frame, a mouth wide where the canopy hung, rows of teeth carved from wood grain. He drew himself inside it, smiling. Neighbors noticed that Nathaniel no longer played with other children. Instead, he measured them with string, muttering about fit. He spoke of dreams where the bed carried him through dark tunnels, where voices promised him a crown made of coffin nails. One evening, a visitor swore they saw him crawl beneath the bed frame and vanish. Hours later, he emerged from the other side, his nightclothes damp, his lips blackened as though he had swallowed soot. The Harrisons dismissed concerns, claiming Nathaniel had a vivid imagination. But the truth was whispered everywhere. The bed had chosen an heir. Doctors were called only once, in late 1837, after Nathaniel Harrison collapsed during Sunday service. 2 physicians from Richmond were summoned. They examined the boy in a private chamber where the bed loomed in silence beside them. Their notes, later smuggled into county records, tell of strange findings, a faint thudding sound emanating from the wood, as if from a heart buried inside. They described air so cold it frosted their instruments. Nathaniel's pulse was irregular, but when he lay upon the bed for rest, his heartbeat aligned with the thudding from the wood. Alarmed, the physicians demanded the family destroy the bed. Instead, the Harrisons paid them to remain quiet. When the doctors refused, the church intervened. Both men fell ill within days. One was buried within a week. The other left town in silence, never to return. From then on, no medical voice spoke against the Harrisons. Records of sickness, death, or disappearance in Ashford were sealed under church decree. Parish ledgers from 1,138 onward contain only blank spaces where names should have been. Science had spoken once, and it had been silenced. What remained was obedience. The town's orphanage, run by the First Protestant Church, soon became a steady pipeline for the Harrisons' appetite. Children adopted by the family never returned. Their absence was excused with polite lies: a sudden fever, a cousin in another county, a new life elsewhere, but no records of travel, death, or adoption survive. One matron, Anna Lee, kept her own private log. In it, she listed the names of every child who vanished after stepping into the Harrison carriage. Samuel, Lydia, Ruth, Benjamin. Her last entry ends mid-sentence, her pen dragged across the page. She was never seen again. Orphans spoke in hushed tones about the Harrisons' visits. They described the youngest son offering them sweets, asking them to lie down just for a moment in the upstairs room. Some claimed they heard the bed humming as if it were pleased. The church not only allowed it but facilitated it. Ministers preached that the orphans were gifts returned to God, and townsfolk accepted the explanation, but the truth was clear. Ashford's orphans were not disappearing. They were being delivered. Rumors swirled of a basement beneath the Harrison home, deeper than the root cellar, hidden by a door covered in stacked coffins. When a group of townsfolk broke in after midnight, they found rows of child-sized coffins arranged neatly, each with scratches along the lids. Some were sealed shut, others half pried open, their satin linings torn by desperate fingernails. The smell was overwhelming: resin, rot, and something metallic, like iron steeped in water. In one corner, they discovered an empty coffin with chains affixed inside, as though to hold someone down. They fled before dawn, swearing never to return. The next Sunday, the minister preached against trespassers, warning that the curious will be buried by their own questions. Within a month, 3 of the intruders had fallen ill. Their hair thinned, their skin bruised with dark blotches, and each died within weeks. Their coffins, ironically, were purchased from the Harrisons themselves. The basement was sealed again, but the memory lingered. The Harrisons' house was not a home. It was a vault. By 1838, Ashford could no longer contain its fear. The disappearances had grown too frequent. Too many empty coffins were being lowered into consecrated soil. Too many parents whispered of lullabies at their windows, of children drawn to the Harrison estate at night. A meeting was called in the town square. Farmers, mothers, merchants, even church deacons gathered to demand an end to the Harrisons' practices. Some called for the bed to be burned, others for the family to be cast out. But as the meeting commenced, a sickness swept through the crowd. Dozens fell pale, sweating, clutching their stomachs. Their eyes rolled back, their teeth chattered violently. Within hours, several were dead. The survivors spoke of a sound, low, resin, intimidating from beneath the cobblestones of the square, like something breathing beneath their feet. A few swore they saw the shadow of a canopy pass over them, though no object stood above. By dawn, the meeting was dissolved. The town's leaders declared it God's punishment for disobedience. The Harrisons were not mentioned again in public. The bed had claimed not just children now, but voices of dissent. And Ashford learned the lesson clearly. Resistance was burial. In January of 1839, fire engulfed the Harrison estate. It began in the parlor, where candles burned perpetually beside the stacked coffins. Flames roared through the timber walls, devouring drapes, portraits, staircases. Townsfolk rushed to watch from the square, whispering that perhaps God had intervened at last. The Harrisons were never seen fleeing. Some swore they stood calmly in the windows as the fire consumed them, their silhouettes motionless against the red glow. Others claimed they were chanting, their voices rising above the crackling wood. By morning, the house was ash. Only one object survived, unscathed, resting amid the blackened ruins, the bed. Its mahogany frame stood untouched, linens white and unsinged, canopy pristine. When men tried to move it, the bed resisted. Ropes snapped, oxen strained, and still it sat rooted in the earth. At last the church intervened, ministers declared it a relic, and the bed was taken into custody under a shroud of secrecy. The fire destroyed the Harrisons. But the bed lived on, untouched, waiting. For a time the bed vanished from record, but in 1850 it resurfaced. Auction logs from Richmond list a mahogany canopy bed, fine condition, purchased by an anonymous buyer for an unusually high sum. The auctioneer's notes mention its strange weight, as though more stone than wood, and an unnatural chill that clung to the storage hall until it was removed. Soon after, disappearances began again, this time in a boarding house along the James River. Guests reported strange drafts, children went missing from the streets, and neighbors spoke of lullabies drifting from shuttered windows. The boarding house burned within the year. Once again, the bed survived untouched, carried away under the cover of night. Each time it reappeared, the same pattern followed: fire, disappearance, silence. Always, the church or affiliated institutions claimed custody of it, citing safekeeping. Always, records grew sparse, then vanished altogether. The bed was no longer merely the Harrisons' obsession. It had become an inheritance passed hand to hand, hidden in plain sight. By the late 19th century, the Harrisons were no longer mentioned in polite company. Their name disappeared from parish rolls, property ledgers, and even gravestones. It was as if the family had never existed, but silence itself is evidence. Local archives show whole decades missing, ledgers excised, sermons rewritten. Pages that once detailed the fire of 1839, the empty coffins, the disappearances, all ripped clean from record. The handwriting resumes after, unbroken, as though nothing happened. In 1872, a county clerk confessed in a private letter that he had been ordered to destroy all documents bearing reference to the Harrison affair. He admitted he burned them, but not before reading one report. The bed had been placed in the cellar of a seminary outside Richmond. The seminary was under church authority, and the students were warned never to enter the locked room beneath the chapel. Those who whispered of the Harrisons were branded superstitious. Ministers preached that dwelling on the past invites the devil. Generations of Ashford children grew up never hearing the name, yet families remembered. In hushed tones at kitchen tables, in stories told only by candlelight, they spoke of the coffins, of the bed that breathed. Of the children who never came home, history did not forget. It was made to forget. The last traceable mention of the Harrison bed appears in 1904. In the records of a small seminary dormitory near Petersburg. Students reported hearing hymns at night, hymns no one had taught them. A janitor swore he found claw marks inside a locked trunk in the basement. Several boys went missing during winter term, their beds left perfectly made, as though they had never slept there at all. The seminary burned in 1907. Witnesses once again reported the same miracle. Amid the blackened ruins, one object stood intact. After that, the trail ends. Some say the bed was taken to a church vault. Others whisper it was sold quietly, perhaps even shipped north. What is certain is that disappearances followed its path. Always children, always silence, and perhaps that is the most terrifying truth. Not that the bed consumed the Harrisons or Ashford or even the orphanage children, but that it may still exist, waiting in an attic, a basement, or a locked storeroom of a church that dares not admit what it keeps. A coffin disguised as comfort, a mouth disguised as wood, a relic disguised as rest, the bed of the dead.